Please like and subscribe my channel. Chapter 21 Target. As soon as the rats fell on him and attacked him, Nick gritted his teeth in fury. They had an unspoken agreement. "You'll regret this," Nick shouted. This was different from the nightmare. The parasite only had a limited number of rats, and Nick could cause real damage to the parasite by killing them. However, the rats could also cause real damage to Nick. After all, they were real. 5 rats immediately jumped on Nick. Nick's right hand grabbed one of them and squeezed. Creakash. The rat was squeezed into a thin sock of wet meat. At the same time, Nick's left hand turned into a fist and punched a second rat. Boom. The rat shot into the distance and hit the water over 50 meters away from Nick, skipping twice on the surface. However, the other 3 rats reached Nick and immediately bit into his body. One of them bit his right biceps, and the other 2 bit his chest. At the same time, Nick saw several more rats coming out from the water around him. Nick gritted his teeth in pain and hatred. Nick grabbed one of the rats and pulled. Creakash. The rat's body was torn off, but the head remained stuck in Nick's biceps. Bang. Another rat was turned into paste by another one of Nick's punches. The last one let go and dove into the water while the other rats came closer. Just a second later, 3 more rats were jumping at Nick. Nick released several more attacks, but the rats just kept going after him without pause. Even more, the rats even started to attack him from below the surface. Nick's rage grew as he kept tearing the rats into pieces. It was never ending. Some seconds later, Nick had already killed over 15 rats. Yet, they just kept on coming. The parasite really went all in. I would already be dead without my ability. And then, Nick's eyes widened. My ability. Nick stopped resisting the rats. My ability shouldn't be working right now. Yet, I am tearing these rats apart like they are paper. My ability is still active. This can only mean one thing. The realization had positive and negative aspects to it. On one hand, Nick wasn't being attacked by the real parasite, which meant that he had not actually been injured. But on the other hand, Nick had spun around so many times during the battle that he didn't even know which direction he was facing. In the end, Nick could only grit his teeth as he took one of the tubes from his thigh and broke it. Creakash. All the rats vanished as Nick was swallowed by light. Just now, Nick had been in the street of the sewers, but as soon as the light appeared around him, Nick saw that he was still about 2 meters away from the real street. Nick had still been in the darkness. The nightmare had made it seem like I had already reached the end when I actually hadn't. Nick immediately swam over to the street, which wasn't difficult with only 2 meters between him and it. Now, Nick was actually back in the street of light. The nightmare can even create illusions of light, Nick thought with anxiety and fear. This is not something I can compete with. Nick looked back at the dark domain he had just left behind. At least I'm out now. The next moment, he looked around the sewers. There were over 100 similarly big domains. Nick had gone through hell and had used 2 arc lights after going just through one of them. This is beyond my level. Silence. Nick had been down here for several hours now, and he had become quite familiar with the sewers. But in the end, he had to leave without any gains. Even worse, Nick had even used 2 arc lights. Guess I'm going to become an inspector now. It's probably not a bad job. I get to leave the dregs, and I can probably also get a normal home. Maybe I can even build a family. Yet, no matter how enticing the position as an inspector seemed to Nick, he still felt regret. For a while, Nick just looked at the ceiling of the sewers. This would be his last excursion as a Zephyx extractor. Winter had already used up all the money he had access to. He had bet everything on Nick. Sadly, Nick would only disappoint him. Silence. Nick just watched the ceiling in silence. A bird flew past him. Suddenly, Nick's eyes widened. A bird. Nick's eyes immediately locked onto the bird as it entered a black domain representing a block of houses. Just now, Nick had been set on giving up. But now, he was hesitating again. A bird. That must have been the dreamer. Nick's heart rate rose rapidly as adrenaline shot through his body. After hours, its old target must have woken up or died, and it had to go to a new one. Nick's eyes locked onto the black domain where the dreamer had to be in right now. There were no toilets in this block, and the block was about 50 by 50 meters. In the center of the block was the ruin of a stony tower, which supported the block of houses above it in the middle. As Nick looked at the domain, images of what had happened to him earlier reappeared in his mind. Pain, deceit, horror, death. Nick was finally free. He could finally leave the sewers. He no longer needed to go through the darkness again. But the dreamer was right there. Just once more. Just one more time. But what if he didn't succeed? He might be risking his life for nothing. After all, the dreamer was obviously at the ceiling of the sewers. Nick would need to swim for about 20 meters in pure darkness, climb 10 meters of the structure, and then catch the dreamer. And he had to do that all in pure silence so that the dreamer wouldn't notice him and in the nightmare's illusionary hell. He couldn't even use the last arclight since that would immediately draw the dreamer's focus to Nick, which would deactivate his ability. At that point, Nick wouldn't be any stronger than a normal human. In such a state, the dreamer could probably just kill Nick without relying on the nightmare or the environment. If the dreamer noticed him, he would die. No matter how Nick thought about it. It was impossible. Chapter 22 The Climb. It was impossible. No matter how long he thought about it. It was just impossible. Yet, Nick just couldn't stop getting excited. He wanted to do it. He wanted to try it. Ellipsis. But he would likely die. Nick clenched his fists. I know it's a shit idea. I know I will most likely die. But I have to give it a go. I just have to give it a shot. Otherwise, I will never become happy. Nick took a deep breath. Then, Nick silently swam over to the black domain. Nick tried his best to move as silently as possible as he moved in a circle around the domain. He poked his head into the darkness and looked at the ceiling from different angles. Since Nick now knew what the dreamer looked like, he could search a larger area of the ceiling. However, even after searching for over 15 minutes near the edge, Nick still couldn't find the dreamer. This means it has to be at the center. It's probably even sitting on a part of the broken tower. The tower in the middle had several holes in it and a very uneven surface. Half of it had collapsed, while the other half supported the block of houses above it. The dreamer had to either be in one of the higher windows or on top of one of the two walls leading up to the ceiling. Nick took a deep breath and looked for a good way upward. I have to move silently. This means I can't just jump from wall to wall. I have to climb constantly and consistently. After a bit of looking around, Nick found a fitting spot. I can only climb the small windows at the tall front of the ruin. I think the tower is just one big spiral staircase in the middle, but I doubt that the spiral staircase is still intact. I could attempt to walk up the staircase, but the nightmare's illusions won't allow me to actually see where I'm going, and if I'm not careful, I might actually fall through a broken or missing step. That would alert the dreamer to my location. Nick just looked at the broken tower. It was so enticing. He could just use the stairs. Nick sighed. Nick couldn't trust his eyes in the darkness, and since he couldn't inspect the staircase from here, he couldn't risk climbing it. He had to navigate blindly, and he preferred taking the difficult route he could see instead of the potentially easy route that he couldn't see. Luckily, there are quite a lot of windows. Right to left for about 3 windows. Jump to the top right to grab the lowest one of the next floor of stairs and climb another 3. After that, 2 more windows will be above me and 1 more window above those. There's a small chance that the dreamer is in the 2 lower ones but a relatively high one that it's in the highest one. Nick went over this plan a couple more times. And finally, he was done. The plan was set. Nick slowly swam to his starting position, which was facing the highest part of the ruined tower. Silence. Nick couldn't see the dreamer right now, but he knew that it was there. He knew that the likelihood of death was very high, but he had to do it. Nick took a deep breath as he closed his eyes. Silence. Seconds passed. Nick's eyes shot open, and he swam forward. As soon as Nick entered the darkness, he closed his eyes again. Then, he suddenly submerged. Swimming on the surface was way too loud, which was why Nick decided to move forward while being about a meter below the surface. Almost immediately, Nick felt several small fish glide across his body. It was like Nick had been submerged in a thick vat of small fish. The bodies of the fish disoriented Nick's senses, and he couldn't even feel the liquid around him anymore. Was he swimming forward or downward? He had already lost all sense of direction. The only thing I can rely on is my muscle memory. As long as I order my body to continue swimming forward, no matter what, I will reach the tower. However, just 2 seconds later, Nick felt things around him change. The mouths of the fish opened, and they started to tear into his body. Right now, Nick was surrounded by a pile of swimming maws with terrifying teeth. They were tearing at Nick's muscles, bones, and tendons. The pain was horrible. Nick's body kept shaking, but he just kept moving forward. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real. The pain isn't real. It isn't real. Nevertheless, Nick felt like a dark void of hopelessness had opened in his chest. Just continue. Nick's flesh and blood were scattering across his surroundings. He was dying. But he continued. He had to continue. Bang. Suddenly, Nick hit something solid. Did I reach it? But then, Nick found an issue. Was this actually the end? Or was this another illusion by the nightmare? At this moment, Nick's emotions were going crazy. Was he? Wasn't he? In a state of panic, Nick did the first thing that came to his mind. Bang! Nick rammed his face against the wall. Nick immediately felt his eyes water as his nose broke in several places. This feels real. The nightmare's illusions were terrifyingly accurate, but when Nick compared the nightmare's sense of pain with actual pain, there was something different. Yes, the pain the nightmare created was real, but there were some accompanying sensations missing. For example, Nick had felt his entire head and mind vibrate when he had headbutted the wall. Additionally, Nick had felt like he was about to lose consciousness for just a moment. While the pain was the same, these sensations didn't exist when the nightmare created an illusion. Luckily, the ruin is massive. The dreamer shouldn't have felt that vibration. The next moment, Nick surfaced and grabbed the wall in front of him with his hands. I have to find the first window. In Nick's mind, he was rubbing against a huge wall as he desperately tried to find an invisible hole in it. Where is it? There. Nick felt something and pulled himself up with one arm. This proves that my ability is still active, which means the dreamer hasn't noticed me yet. Creakish. The hole Nick had put his hand into suddenly sprouted teeth and was grinding it into a meaty paste. Nick's eyes became bloodshot beneath his eyelids as he tried to ignore the pain. After pulling himself up, Nick moved his hand to the left and jumped. He knew where the window should be, but he didn't know where it was exactly. Creak. Nick's hand entered a hole, but his fingers hit the other side of the window, splitting the nails of two of his fingers. Nick just gritted his teeth as he grabbed the window with his hand. The fact that he could stop his jump with one hand meant that the dreamer still hadn't noticed him. The next moment, the wall seemed to split open, and Nick felt like he was falling through it. It's not real. Nick moved his bleeding fingertips to the left side and felt the scratching feeling traveling over his body. He was still in the window. Even though Nick felt like he was falling into a never-ending abyss of pain, he jumped once more to the left. Creak. One of Nick's nails exploded off his body as it hit the wall of the window again. But when Nick felt that he could still pull himself upward with one arm, he became more excited. I'm doing it. Nick hadn't opened his eyes yet. He had done all of this blind. Now, for the most difficult jump. After amending his plan a bit, Nick decided to jump to the second window in the second row. The jump was a bit higher vertically but not as long horizontally. Nick's knees bent down, and he gathered all his power. The next moment, Nick jumped upward. In Nick's illusory reality, he felt like he was jumping upward hundreds of meters. It was impossible to tell how high he had actually jumped. Nick felt the wall in front of him rapidly move as he desperately tried to find the window. Fear and terror reached new heights. Crack. When Nick felt the tips of the fingers of his left arm getting crushed, he felt elated. The window. Nick fell a bit, but he managed to grab the bottom of the window with both of his hands. By now, Nick's left hand had become severely injured, with a couple of broken bones and destroyed nails. He pulled himself into the window easily, which meant the dreamer hadn't noticed him yet. He was so close. Nick quickly jumped to the left again as razors appeared on the wall in front of him, cutting his chest into pieces. Crack. Nick felt the impact of his broken bones rubbing against each other and grabbed the window. After pulling himself into the window, Nick's excitement reached new heights. He was so close. He could do it. Instead of jumping towards the next window, Nick grabbed the last tube of arc light. The next moment, Nick opened his eyes. A red hellscape of flesh and blades encompassed his reality. Everything was being consumed by the nightmare. However, Nick's eyes only looked forward with determination. Then, he threw the tube of arc light upwards with all of his power. Bang! The tube broke, and the arc light exploded at the ceiling of the dark domain. For an instant, all the darkness vanished as a shining star seemingly appeared in the dark sky. The hellscape vanished, and Nick found himself in the third window of the second row. However, Nick's eyes immediately moved across the ruins above him. There, in the highest window, Nick saw a black owl with black eyes. It was quite big, over half a meter tall. At this moment, the owl was looking at the arclight shining on the ceiling. This was why Nick had thrown the arclight instead of breaking it directly. The dreamer's attention would remain fully on the arclight, and Nick would get a bit of time to reach the dreamer with his ability. As long as he managed to grab it without it noticing him, he could break several of its bones, turning it almost helpless. When Nick saw his target, his eyes narrowed, and he immediately jumped upward with all of his power. Nick easily and quickly grabbed the window directly above him, but instead of pulling himself into the window, Nick continued. The dreamer was now paying attention to its surroundings, and pulling into the window would take too long. Because of that, Nick immediately pulled himself upward and threw himself at the dreamer. The dreamer was still looking at the arclight. Nick was only a meter away from the dreamer. But then, he noticed that his jump hadn't been strong enough, and he found himself dropping. Nick gritted his teeth and rammed his feet into the broken stone of the tower. Some of his toes broke, but Nick managed to create a hole in the wall, making a foothold. Naturally, that was extremely loud, and the dreamer's head turned towards Nick. But Nick had already jumped again. Nick was flying at the dreamer. The dreamer was turning to Nick. Nick's hand came closer. And then, their eyes met. Nick managed to grab the wing of the dreamer. He pulled with all of his strength. The dreamer pulled its wing upward. Creakash. Nick tore out a couple of feathers. His ability no longer worked. He didn't have enough strength to break the wing. Nick's expression turned into shock and horror as he felt himself fall. The dreamer's black eyes looked into Nick's eyes. No. Chapter 23. Run. No. I was so close. Nick's ability no longer worked, which meant he was only a bit stronger than an average human right now. At this moment, Nick was falling from about 8 meters of height into a pool of toxic waste with several sharp pieces of metal. While Nick's ability was working, this wasn't an issue. But now, Nick's thoughts stopped. Time seemed to freeze. And then, time resumed as the dreamer got further and further away from Nick. Splash! Nick hit the liquid shoulder first. Creakash! Creakash! Several pieces of metal created cuts in Nick's skin, and he started to bleed. On top of that, Nick's destroyed fingers also came into contact with the toxic liquid. In an instant, Nick felt like his body was being drowned in acid. The force of the fall also made it difficult for Nick to move, but his adrenaline pushed him to immediately go to the surface. As soon as Nick broke the surface again, he took a deep breath. But then, Nick saw the owl just a meter in front of him, its claws stretched towards Nick. The dreamer was attacking, and without his ability, Nick was helpless. Bang! Nick immediately pulled his head down into the water, and the next moment, 2 long claws tore through the water above him. The dreamer was not going to flee. No, it was going to kill Nick. Nick immediately dove further and further down, several pieces of metal scraping his skin. But then, Nick suddenly accelerated, and he stopped getting injured. Nick had reached a depth where the light couldn't reach him, which meant that the dreamer couldn't see him anymore. Nick's ability activated again. I have to flee, Nick thought. As long as it pays attention to me, I can't fight it. After coming to a decision, he immediately shot towards the direction of the sewer's exit. But then, a huge black eye opened in front of Nick, and he became paralyzed. Nick's thoughts stopped as he looked at the terrifying black eye. The next moment, a maw filled with teeth opened in front of him and swallowed him. Nick felt his body getting torn apart, but then he realized that this wasn't real. Since he was now in a place with no light, the nightmare's influence had returned. The dreamer above. The nightmare below. I can't move like this. The nightmare could lead me in any random direction. I have to surface to assess the direction I'm facing. Nick gnashed his teeth and shot upward. The eyes and maws around him slowly vanished. The arclight was still active, and it illuminated the surroundings. Shortly before Nick broke the surface, he suddenly felt the acid of the liquid become stronger. This meant the dreamer was seeing him. Nick broke past the surface and took a breath as he quickly looked around. There, Nick found the way he had to go towards and immediately dove into the water again. Crrrsh. Nick clenched his teeth even more as he felt a big gash opening up on his back. Just now, the dreamer had created 3 huge gashes as it tore Nick's skin and a bit of muscle apart. This was a specter, not a random bird. If it got hold of Nick, it could probably stab one of its claws through his entire torso. A normal human couldn't possibly fight something like this. As Nick descended, the intensity of the acid subsided. He closed his eyes and immediately started to swim forward. A moment later, the heat of the water rose sharply, and it felt like Nick was swimming through a boiling pot of oil. Nick's entire body turned red, and he wanted to do nothing but scream in pain. He was burning. He was dying. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. Bang! Suddenly, Nick's right hand hit something solid, and Nick's head quickly followed. A house. Now, Nick had hit one of the ruins. He had to quickly make a decision. Immediately, he shot up. The house wasn't that tall, and there was still about a meter between its ceiling and the surface. At this moment, Nick felt a bit of light, but his ability hadn't deactivated yet. This meant that the dreamer hadn't seen him. Nick swam forward in silence, his chest almost sliding against the house's roof. Suddenly, the water started to severely burn him again, and Nick's body shook. His ability had deactivated. At that moment, a plan formed in Nick's mind, and he slowly spun onto his back. Nick was betting on the fact that the dreamer could see him but not perfectly see him. Right now, since Nick was still about a meter below the surface, the dreamer could probably only see a vague silhouette or shadow. Meanwhile, the dreamer was illuminated by the light behind it, allowing Nick to perfectly see it. At this moment, the dreamer was diving towards him with its outstretched claws. Nick's anxiety reached new heights. The dreamer reached him. Bang! Nick shoved himself to the side as the dreamer's claws reached into the water. Due to Nick's depth, the dreamer also had to fully enter the liquid, slowing it down significantly. The dreamer's claws barely passed by Nick, and Nick immediately grabbed them with his 2 hands. The dreamer's wings flapped to get out of the liquid again, and Nick felt himself getting pulled up. Splash! The 2 of them left the liquid behind, the dreamer pulling Nick into the sky. Right now, the dreamer didn't have the luxury to look at Nick, but Nick's ability still didn't reactivate. Hearing and feeling someone also counted as perceiving someone. After gaining a couple of meters, the dreamer looked at Nick, and its beak opened. But by now, Nick had repositioned himself. He had pulled himself upward and had angled his body. And then, bang! Nick kicked the dreamer's head. While the dreamer was much more powerful than Nick without his ability, a kick to the head still hurt quite a lot. At the same time, Nick let go of the dreamer's claws and threw himself towards the exit of the sewers. His kick and the force of the jump completely disoriented the dreamer, and it fell into the water a couple of meters away. However, it wasn't significantly injured, and Nick was sure that it would return to flying above him in a matter of seconds. Only about 200 meters or so left to the exit. I refuse to believe that it will follow me to the surface. Nick immediately swam forward, and since the dreamer was still in the water, his ability had reactivated, and he swam with all of his power. Splash! Some seconds later, Nick heard the loud sound of something leaving the water about 30 meters behind him. 5 seconds after the sound, Nick's ability deactivated again. Nick gritted his teeth and dove into the water. More scratches appeared across his body. Bang! But the dreamer's attack missed, and Nick's ability reactivated. Sadly, just moments later, an army of moths tore at Nick's body again, and Nick felt like he was swimming downward instead of forward. Yet, Nick just kept swimming. He ignored the pain. He ignored the horrors. Bang! Then, Nick hit something solid again. This is that one house I investigated. I'm just about 50 meters away from the exit. By now, Nick's lungs were screaming at him to surface. I have to run across it. Nick surfaced again. However, his ability deactivated before he even breached the surface. The dreamer wasn't stupid. It had seen where Nick had swam towards, and it was constantly looking in that direction. Nevertheless, Nick rapidly moved forward as he did his best to run in waist-high water. He turned back to look at where the dreamer was. The next moment, he saw the dreamer dive towards him. Nick couldn't evade. There were still several meters left. The dreamer would get him. Chapter 24, Struggle. Nick readied himself. He had to do something. At that moment, Nick's back began to burn, or at least, it felt like it. Light appeared around Nick. And then, something shocking happened. The dreamer's eyes burst into flames. Scree! The Dreamer screeched, and it did its best to stop its dive. Nick had no idea what was happening. "Nick!" someone shouted between coughs. Nick looked back. Winter. Winter was standing just behind him, his expensive suit drenched in sewer water. At this moment, a bright fire was burning around Winter, and his eyes had turned completely white. "Get it!" Winter shouted before heaving and looking away from Nick. Immediately, Nick felt his ability become active again. When the Dreamer's eyes had caught fire, its sight had been robbed from it, which meant that it couldn't perceive Nick anymore. Nick immediately turned towards the Dreamer, which was about to pass about 2 meters above him. Rage appeared in Nick's eyes. Bang! Nick jumped with all of his power, the water around him exploding. And then, he punched. Crack! Nick's fist hit the center of the Dreamer's chest, and Nick swore he felt something break. And this time, it was not one of his bones. The Dreamer's body spun in the air, and its flapping became very disorderly. Nick landed first, and he immediately rushed toward the place where the Dreamer would land. Splash! The Dreamer hit the water, and Nick jumped on it. Bang! Nick kicked one of the Dreamer's wings, easily breaking it. The next moment, Nick grabbed the Dreamer's thick neck with both of his arms and squeezed. Nick's ability deactivated again, but that didn't matter. Squeezing someone's neck didn't need a huge difference in power. Right now, Nick and the Dreamer were tumbling in the horrible liquid of the sewers as he tried to strangle it. Yet, some seconds later, the Dreamer's head spun by 180 degrees. Right, it's a fucking owl. Nick thought in horror. The Dreamer's beak opened as it tried to tear Nick's neck apart. Nick quickly let go of the Dreamer's neck. His left arm pushed the Dreamer away from his neck as his right arm shot towards its head. The next moment, the Dreamer just saw 2 fingers become bigger and bigger in its vision. Creakish! The Dreamer screeched as Nick's fingers crushed its eyes. The Dreamer's screech was cut off as the liquid from the sewers entered its throat. Nick gnashed his teeth in rage as his 2 fingers dug deep into the Dreamer's eye sockets. Nick's thumb grabbed the bottom of the Dreamer's beak, and he grabbed it with all of his power. The next moment, Nick wrestled with the Dreamer awkwardly until he eventually managed to get behind its back with his fingers still in its eye sockets. Splash! A splash appeared beside Nick, and Winter appeared beside Nick. "Keep it like this," Winter shouted. By now, Nick's legs had also grabbed the Dreamer's body, and he was doing his best not to drown in the sewers. The Dreamer was still flailing around in panic, and Nick had to do everything in his power to keep it suppressed. The next moment, Winter took out some kind of flexible metallic cable and wrapped it around the Dreamer's neck. The cable quickly started to shine red, and the Dreamer's struggles intensified. However, Nick kept it stable. After around 10 seconds, the Dreamer's struggles became weaker, and half a minute later, it completely stopped moving. "Can I let go?" Nick asked. "You, can," Winter said with a heave. Nick slowly took his hand out of the Dreamer's eye sockets but still kept hold of the Dreamer. "Put it in the sack on the shore," Winter said quickly before he had to heave again. Nick nodded and pulled the Dreamer towards the exit. About a minute later, Nick reached the exit of the sewers, and he pulled the Dreamer onto the land. Now, Nick could actually take a good look at the Dreamer. Its chest was caved in. Both of its wings were broken, the second one having gotten broken in the scuffle. Black blood was flowing out of its empty eyes. One of its legs was bent at an unnatural angle. Many feathers were missing. Luckily, this was a specter. These wounds were not enough to kill a specter, and it would recover within a week at most. Nick took a deep breath. And then, pain assaulted him. 2 of Nick's fingernails were missing on his left hand. 3 of Nick's fingers were broken. Nick had several cuts on his body. He had 3 huge gashes going across his back. Nick even felt some intense pain coming from his ribs. He guessed they had gotten bruised or broken during the scuffle in the water. And to top it all off, his nose was also broken. Nick was in a world of pain, and he also knew that the wounds were bound to get horribly infected since they had all been washed quite thoroughly in the disgusting liquid of the sewers. He only hoped that Winter had some way to help him recover. Nick knew if he had to rely on the medicine available in the dregs, he would die. His ability gave him some resistance to infections and poisons, but he wasn't sure if that was enough in this case. Nick heard Winter heave as he came out of the sewers. Nick turned to Winter and looked at him. Right now, Winter was on his knees and hands as he coughed and heaved like he was about to die. He wasn't able to follow me into the sewers earlier, but when he saw me in danger, he actually jumped in. Nick's trust in Winter reached new heights. Winter, the fancy heir of the Melfian family, a guy that constantly wiped his hands whenever he touched anything even slightly dirty, had jumped into the sewers to save him. Maybe he isn't as stuck up as I had initially thought. When it comes down to it, he is actually trustworthy. Nick took a deep breath. Right now, he felt elated. The risk had paid off. He had done it. Winter, Nick said. Nick only heard another heave. We did it. Chapter 25, Walking Back. It took Winter a while to recover, but eventually, he managed to stop puking his heart out. While Winter had been puking, Nick had shoved the dreamer into the sack they had brought with them. The sack was just a normal sack. When Winter stood up and saw the sack, all his unhappiness and disgust seemed to vanish. A specter. They had a specter in their grasp. They actually had one. Then, Winter saw Nick, and he had to take a deep breath. Nick looked really worn out. Blood was flowing from several parts of his body, and Winter already knew that all these wounds would get infected very soon. Are you okay? Winter asked. Do I look like I'm okay? Nick asked. Winter winced, but Nick just laughed. Relax, I'm okay. I'm just joking, Nick said. Winter sighed. You look really messed up, you know. I know, Nick answered. So, got anything that I can use to deal with these wounds? I kind of don't want to die, you know. Winter just nodded. We can visit a hospital in the outer city. Since we now have a specter, the money is going to flow in soon. Additionally, I need you to be at your best. After all, you're the chief extractor, which means that you not only have to work with the dreamer but also find out how to work with it. Every specter is unique, and every specter needs to be treated differently to get the most Zephyx out of them. Nick just nodded before he grabbed the sack with the dreamer. A moment later, Nick noticed how light the sack actually was with surprise. Huh, that's lighter than expected, Nick said. Specters have a lot of power, but they are using Zephyx converted from Prefix as their main source of power, Winter explained. Specters are actually pretty light. They are not made of a lot of Zephyx, but the Zephyx is so potent that they still manage to unleash incredible powers. That tall bird probably barely weighs 5 kilos. Nick nodded. The next moment, he slung the sack over his shoulders. The cable that Winter had put around the dreamer was something that Nick had already heard about. It was a Zephyx blocker, something that was used to stop the flow of Zephyx. At this moment, the Zephyx blocker was using up its stored energy to stop the dreamer's Zephyx from flowing. Since this was the lowest grade, it would only work for about 5 hours when put on a level 1 specter. This meant that Winter and Nick had to deliver the dreamer to their headquarters within the next 5 hours, but that was plenty of time. Winter and Nick walked out of the entrance to the sewers and emerged in an abandoned part of the dregs. Winter immediately took a deep breath of the dregs. He had never imagined that he would one day find the air in the dregs to be refreshing and enjoyable. As the two of them walked through the dregs, they saw all the people look at them with disgust while avoiding them. These two smelled absolutely abhorrent, even by the dregs' standards. However, the two of them didn't pay a lot of attention to the onlookers. They were far too excited about finally having caught their first specter. After about half an hour, they finally left the densest part of the dregs behind, and they entered the outskirts. The streets transitioned from being made of rusty metal into being made of polished metal, and the houses also started to become more uniform and orderly. Naturally, the people on the streets also seemed more well-dressed, and their reactions to the two of them were even more disgusted. Stop. The two stopped as their brows furrowed. The next moment, two people wearing black combat uniforms walked up to them. The two men looked with disgust at them while they were holding their noses. People like you are not welcome here. Leave the outer city, or we'll make you. One of them shouted. Naturally, the two of them were city guards, and it was part of their duty to keep the outer city clean from unsavory people. Two people stinking of piss and shit could be seen as unsavory. Winter put his hand in this pocket. One of the two guards narrowed his eyes and shot forward, grabbing Winter's arm before he could get it back out of his pocket. The guard thought that Winter was about to pull a weapon on them. Stop resisting. The guard shouted as he pulled Winter's arm violently out of his pocket. Creak. The next moment, Winter's wrist seemed to give, and it extended a bit further than it should. His wrist had been dislocated by the guard. While Winter had an ability from a specter, he was not an athletic person, while the guards were very athletic and strong. Winter gritted his teeth as the guard pulled his arm to the side to lock it behind his back. The next moment, the guard wrestled Winter to the ground. While all of this was happening, Nick locked eyes with the other guard. Then, Nick looked down for a small moment before looking at the guard again. Naturally, the guard realized that Nick had essentially told him to look down. The guard glanced down, and he saw a small card, which had just fallen out of Winter's hand. The guard furrowed his brows as he looked at Nick, who only stared back without saying anything. In the end, the second guard kneeled down to retrieve the card. After looking at the card, the guard's face turned white in horror as he looked at Winter, who was held on the ground by the other guard. The second guard immediately jumped over to the first guard and pulled him off. "James, stop." The first guard shoved the second guard away with annoyance. "What's your problem?" he shouted. The second guard shoved the card into the first guard's hands with urgency. The second guard looked at the card with annoyance. But then, his eyes widened, and he turned to look at the person below him with terror. At this moment, Winter glared at the guard with venom. The guard froze. In his hand, the guard currently held a residency card for the highest floor of the inner city, and the name on the card was Winter Melfian. Naturally, the guards knew exactly who they were currently looking at. Chapter 26, Contained. "Wait here," Winter ordered with a curt and annoyed voice as he and Nick entered their warehouse. The two guards waited in front of the building like two children who had just been yelled at, which wasn't inaccurate. Naturally, after they had realized that they had just shoved one of the heirs of the Melfian family to the ground, they had immediately apologized profusely. Winter had just acted very calmly but coldly and told them that they were going to be following them for a bit. The two guards didn't protest. As the door of the warehouse closed in front of them, the anxiety of the two guards exploded. If Winter decided to get his family's lawyers involved, they could very well lose their jobs, if not worse. Meanwhile, Nick and Winter walked over to the only containment unit they owned. Nick waited in front of the entrance while Winter operated a console with many buttons to the side of the containment unit. A moment later, a loud alarm came from the containment unit as red lights lit up everywhere. The two of them weren't surprised. This was the alarm of a containment unit being fully opened. The cheapest containment units only had 3 ways to open them. First, opening a tiny door to put handheld objects into it. Second, opening a door for a human to get through. Third, opening the big gate to put a specter in. But wait, the Dreamer was quite small. Why couldn't Nick just carry it through the normal door? Well, a containment unit was more than just a big cube of steel. There were also several sensors, alarms, barriers, and defenses on it. When a human passed through the door, the containment unit wouldn't care, but if a specter tried to pass through it, all the defenses would activate. Otherwise, small and sneaky specters would be able to sneak out of the containment unit when people walked in and out of it. So, when a specter was put into a containment unit, one had to open the main gate, which also deactivated all of the defenses. Naturally, more expensive containment units had more ways to open them, but this was just the cheapest variant. After the big gate fully opened, Nick walked into the containment unit. The gate slowly closed behind him again. When it was fully closed, the artificial light appeared in the containment unit. Normal artificial light didn't help against the nightmare's influence, but containment units could use Zephyx to illuminate the inside. More expensive containment units had special tunnels made of reflective glass, which would safely deliver sunlight into the containment unit, cutting down on the cost of lighting. Sadly, their shitty containment unit didn't have such luxury. They had to make do with using Zephyx to light the inside. Luckily, they only needed to light the inside when a human was in there since specters didn't need light. When the light turned on, Nick dumped the Dreamer into the middle of the containment unit. Due to the Zephyx blocker, the Dreamer didn't move. Nick looked at the motionless Dreamer for a couple of seconds until the normal door of the containment unit opened behind him. Nick bent forward and grabbed the Zephyx blocker. After entangling it, Nick ran out of the containment unit, and Winter immediately closed the door. Silence. They had done it. The Dreamer was inside of the containment unit. Winter looked at the console beside the containment unit and checked its operating status. A couple of minutes later, Winter nodded with a sigh of relief. Everything is operating normally. The Dreamer has been detected, and the defenses are ready to engage if it tries anything, Winter said. We don't have to worry about it escaping. Nick nodded while releasing a sigh of relief. Finally, they had the dreamer securely contained. Now, Winter said as his voice turned darker while turning to the exit of the warehouse. Let's deal with those two. What do you have in mind? Nick asked. In exchange, Winter said. The guards are afraid of my background, and they are going to do anything to get my lawyers off their backs. Come, Winter said as he walked to the exit. Nick just followed him. The two of them found the two guards quickly, and Winter told them to follow him. The guards just followed Winter while trying to apologize some more. Eventually, the four of them reached a tall building with the symbol of a green carriage on it. This was one of the biggest hospital chains in the world, and they operated in many cities. The company owning these hospitals was a Zephyx manufacturer primarily, but they had one of the few contained level 6 Spectres. The contained Spectre was a carriage that was called the Merchant. When one threw corpses into the carriage, healing potions came out of the carriage, and a bit of Zephyx would be given off by the carriage. Naturally, the company made use of the healing medicine and created hospitals everywhere. For profit, of course. One recovery bath and I will forget what happened. After all, I need one, Winter said as he shook his dislocated wrist a bit. The two guards took deep breaths and looked at each other in horror. Sir Melfian, I'm not sure. It's either you or your district that will pay for my treatment, Winter said, interrupting the guard. Which one is it? The two guards retreated a bit and talked with each other in whispers. They seemed to argue intensely. It took nearly 3 minutes for them to return. We'll pay, one of them said with a sigh. Winter nodded, and the four of them walked into the hospital. When they walked to the receptionist tried her best to remain somewhat professional under the immense stench that assaulted her. If she hadn't seen the two guards behind the two dirty visitors, she would have already called security to throw them out. Yes, how can I help you? She asked with a forced smile. One full-body recovery bath and one cleansing bath. The two baths are paid separately, Winter said. Of course, the receptionist said, her professionalism now genuine. After all, these were actual customers, apparently. That is 150 credits for the cleansing bath, she said. The next moment, Winter took out a couple of notes and put them on the table. The receptionist collected them with a polite smile and gave Winter a small orange token. And that will be 4,800 credits for the full-body recovery bath, she said. Winter gestured to the guards. One of the guards walked over and handed the receptionist a card. The receptionist thanked him and put the card onto a plate of steel. Then, she grabbed a small piece of something that looked like clay and wrote the number 4,800 on it. The next moment, she put a small signature below the number, and she handed the piece of clay to the guard. The guard released a shaky breath and signed it. Thank you, the receptionist said as she put the card on top of the piece of clay and put everything into a metal box. A green light came out of the box. A moment later, the receptionist took the card out and handed it to the guard. At the same time, she took out the piece of clay, which had now been hardened, and put it under her table. Sadly, there was no easy way to communicate with the bank directly. Every week, the business would deliver the small pieces of clay to the banks and get the money. The receptionist handed Winter a green ticket with several complicated black lines. Winter looked at the two guards. We're done. You can leave. Thank you, sir, one of the guards said. Then, the two guards left the hospital. The next moment, Winter held out his ticket for the full-body recovery path to Nick. Have fun. Chapter 27, A Bath. Nick looked with surprise at Winter. He had thought that Winter would maybe give his ticket to him, but when it actually happened, Nick was still surprised. Nick felt bad accepting something so expensive. You just earned us a ton of money, Winter said, not looking at Nick. Just take it. Nick hesitated, but in the end, he just accepted it. After all, he also didn't really want to die from his injuries, and despite his current demeanor, he was in quite a lot of pain. When Nick took the ticket, Winter nodded. Just follow the signs. I'll wait for you in 3 hours. That's usually how long these baths take. I've had my fair share of them in the past. He had his fair share of them. Nick thought. Nick doubted that Winter had taken a 3-hour bath for every minor injury he had ever received, which meant that Winter had probably been heavily injured multiple times before. Sure, thank you, Winter, Nick said. The next moment, a smile appeared on Winter's face. Have fun, he said again as he walked through one of the doors. Nick looked at the ticket in his hand with anxiety. 4,800 credits. He held 4,800 credits in his hand right now. The most money Nick had ever held in his hands had been 500 after he had finished a quite unsavory job. 4,800 credits was a lot. Eventually, Nick looked around and found some signs hanging from the ceiling. Nick's reading comprehension was still weak, but with enough time, he could understand what he was reading. After wandering around for about 3 minutes, Nick finally found the entrance to the full-body recovery baths. Nick slowly opened the door and looked into the room. It had a couple of lockers and racks for clothing. "Come in," a woman shouted with a friendly tone. Nick awkwardly walked into the room. He had never been in such a place before. When the woman in the room noticed Nick's appearance, a pained and apprehensive smile appeared on her face. Nick just showed her his ticket. "Right this way, sir," she said with a forced smile as she gestured to one of the doors. "Do you prefer to undertake the cleansing bath with or without clothing?" "Cleansing bath?" Nick asked. "I thought this is a full-body recovery bath." The woman just smiled awkwardly. "Sir, it is customary to take a cleansing bath before undertaking a recovery bath. We need you to be clean for the recovery bath to work properly." "Oh," Nick said. "I'd like to keep my clothing on, then." "Of course, sir," the woman said as she opened one of the doors to the side. "Please, step inside." Nick felt out of place, but he followed the woman's instructions. The room Nick entered was quite small, and he could see 5 light blue baths. "Please," the woman said as she gestured towards one of the baths. Nick awkwardly stepped forward and slowly lowered his body into the bath. The blue liquid, which didn't feel like water, got pushed out of the bath but was quickly drained. SSSSSSSS. The next moment, the water around Nick started to bubble and released sounds akin to boiling water. It was quite loud. At the side, the woman's eyes opened widely in shock. "Wow," she involuntarily commented. "Oh," Nick uttered. "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just surprised," the woman said. "I've never heard the cleansing bath become this loud before. This isn't normal." Nick asked. "No, it isn't," the woman said. "The cleansing bath is filled with a liquid that gets used up when it comes into contact with dangerous impurities. The more impurities it comes into contact with, the more liquid gets used up, and when the liquid gets used up, it makes this hissing noise. But it's never been this loud before." "If I may ask, what happened?" she asked. "I fell into the sewers," Nick said. "Fell into," the woman said before she trailed off. She couldn't imagine falling into the sewers. How would that even happen? She had never even seen the sewers in her life. Naturally, since the normal outer city didn't have rusty metal grates as their flooring, the woman had never seen or smelled the sewers. Because of that, she also had no idea just how dirty the sewers were. However, when she saw Nick relaxing, she decided to stop asking questions. Right now, except for his heavy injuries, Nick felt great. "Your body has been cleansed," the woman said. "Do you prefer a quick cleansing shower for your head, or are you fine with taking a quick dive in the bath?" "I'll take a quick dive," Nick said. The woman nodded. "About a minute in total should be enough. You can take multiple dives, of course." Nick nodded back, took a breath, and went underwater. For the first time, he was actually happy to be submerged in liquid. Nick couldn't describe just how great this felt. After a minute, Nick surfaced again. "Please, step out," the woman said. Nick did just that, and when he could finally take a good look at his appearance, his eyes widened. He had never been so clean before in his entire life. All the stains in his clothing were gone, and his skin felt so smooth. However, not everything was great. Nick saw that his skin had started to swell in multiple places. Apparently, his wounds were already starting to get infected and swollen. A moment later, Nick heard a shocked gasp, and he turned to the woman. "I'm sorry," she said with genuine worry and pity. "I'm so sorry." Nick wasn't sure what she meant. Since Nick was now clean, the woman could actually see Nick's injuries properly. Broken bones, destroyed nails, and bleeding cuts all across his body. It was like Nick had fallen down a staircase made of swords. "Please, follow me," she said with a slightly urgent voice as she opened the next door. Nick did just that. In the next room, he saw 15 green baths, but compared to the previous baths, there were also several pieces of external equipment. For example, there were breathing masks beside a couple of the baths. Nick also saw that people were in 4 of the baths. "Please, in here," the woman said as she gestured to one of the baths. Nick walked over and slowly entered the bath. As soon as he was fully submerged, he started to feel warm. The next moment, a breathing mask was put on his face, and a hand gently pushed him into the bath. It took some getting used to, but eventually, Nick managed to acclimate to staying below the surface. The feeling the bath gave him was so great and warm that Nick felt himself drift away. In just a couple of minutes later, Nick fell asleep. Chapter 28, Uniform. Eventually, Nick woke up. While everything had felt great, it was not so great that he would finish a whole night's sleep in the bath. Nick wanted to scratch his nose but accidentally hit the breathing mask. After that, he remembered where he was, and he quickly sat up in the bath. The bath was filled with a liquid denser than water, which was why Nick didn't swim in it. When Nick poked his head out, he saw one other person in the baths, but he didn't remember that one. The others probably already left. The next moment, Nick's eyes met with one of the employees, and the employee walked over. It was a woman in a green uniform, but a different one from before. After a bit, the employee reached Nick's bath. "Please, take off the mask." Nick did just that, and the woman looked at Nick's face. A moment later, she wrote something down on a clipboard. "Do you feel pain anywhere?" she asked neutrally. Nick moved his shoulders and legs around a bit. "No, everything feels great," Nick said with surprise. "In your nose?" the woman asked. Nick's eyes widened, and he quickly touched his nose. When he noticed that his nose was also fully healed, he was quite surprised. "It's healed?" he asked in confusion. The employee nodded. "The healing liquid doesn't need to be in direct contact with the injured area. It also seeps through your skin and travels across your body." She wrote a bit more on the clipboard before turning the clipboard around and holding it to Nick. "Sign here, and you can go." Nick slowly and carefully stood up. Surprisingly, the liquid was falling off him without leaving any stains or making him wet. The next moment, Nick took the clipboard into his hand and started to read. Ellipsis. Ellipsis. "Are there any problems?" the employee asked with a slightly impatient tone after over 2 minutes. "Oh, no," Nick answered quickly. "I'm just not very good at reading." The employee just rolled her eyes. "It basically just says that you feel healthy and that you want to leave." Nick nodded. "Okay, but I still want to read it." The employee got even more annoyed, but she didn't say anything. After around 3 more minutes, Nick was finally done. Luckily, there wasn't a lot written on the clipboard, and it wasn't nearly as hard to understand as the NDA Nick signed. Eventually, Nick grabbed the pen on the clipboard and awkwardly signed. He still wasn't used to writing. Nick handed the clipboard back, and the employee quickly grabbed it. "Have a nice day. You can go," she said curtly before walking away. Nick just nodded and walked to the exit. Luckily, there was a second door, which meant that he didn't need to pass through the room with the cleansing baths again. Since Nick hadn't put any of his belongings away, he could directly leave. While Nick was walking through the hospital, he looked around with interest. His life was no longer in danger, which allowed him to appreciate the look of the hospital. Everything seemed so clean. Nick had never seen anything this clean before. It felt so alien to him. Nick had lived in the dregs for his entire life, and the dregs were not the cleanest place. When Nick reached the lobby, he only saw 2 people. The receptionist and a boy. The boy was standing at the side of the lobby with a stack of clothes in his hands, and he awkwardly looked around. The boy was maybe 14 years old or something like that. For a second, the eyes of Nick and the boy met. The boy looked at Nick with anxiety and looked at his clothing. Then, he looked towards the direction of the baths again. "You searching for someone?" Nick asked. The boy was surprised when Nick started a conversation. Yes, the boy answered nervously. "I'm supposed to deliver these clothes to someone called Nick." Nick blinked twice. "That's me." "Oh," the boy uttered as he looked at Nick with surprise. But then, his brows furrowed as he looked at Nick's clothing again. "But your clothing isn't dirty," he said. "I bathed in my clothing," Nick said. "I presume these clothes are from Winter." When the boy heard Nick say Winter's name, he sighed in relief. "Yes," he said. The next moment, he held the clothes forward, and Nick took them. Nick couldn't see all of the clothes since they were folded, but he could see quite a bit of red and black. That was when Nick's eyes widened, and he subconsciously gripped the clothes tighter. Is that Crimson Fungus City's official Zephyx extractor uniform? Nick asked in surprise. The boy nodded with a smile. Yes, sir. At this moment, it really hit Nick. He was a Zephyx extractor. Nick had seen a couple of extractors walking around, and they had worn a uniform just like this one. Crimson Fungus City required all Zephyx extractors to wear this uniform, no matter to which company they belonged. Extractors had to wear the uniform when they were on duty, but they were also encouraged to wear it in their spare time. While it wasn't mandatory for extractors to wear their uniforms in their free time, it had become the norm after many lawsuits. What if an extractor uses their ability? Would they be on duty or not? What if someone tried to steal from them and got incinerated by the extractor's ability? Of course, the city didn't care about the fate of criminals, but they very much cared about the criminals' bodies and blood. Even criminals brought in blood and money. Zephyx extractors are allowed to kill people from the dregs with a good reason. Otherwise, they would need to pay a fine of about 5,000 credits. Extractors are also allowed to kill people of the outer city, but only when the person tried to physically assault them first. Because of the many unnecessary deaths, the city encouraged the extractors to wear their uniform when going out. Even in their spare time. And now, I finally have my very own uniform, Nick thought as he looked at the uniform in his hand. I'm now officially a Zephyx extractor. Chapter 29, Acquaintance. Thanks, Nick said as he looked at the boy again. No problem, the boy said with a polite smile. I will be working under you for the foreseeable future, sir. Nick blinked a couple of times in surprise. You're working for me? The boy nodded. Yes, I'm a steward apprentice in Sir Winter's family, sir. I'm going to be working for the two of you for the next couple of months to gain experience. If there is anything you need, just tell me. Please, also tell me if there is anything I can improve. Nick felt a bit strange being superior to someone else. He hadn't led anyone before. Sure, what's your name? Nick asked. Oh, excuse me, the boy shouted nervously. I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Pator Taylor, sir. Please, refer to me as Pator. Nick nodded. All right, Pator, you can call me Nick. Pator looked quite surprised, calling the chief Zephyx extractor of a Zephyx manufacturer by their first name. Okay, sure. Thank you, Pator said, not daring to call Nick by his name. Nick nodded with a smile and walked out of the hospital, Pator following him. Where's Winter? Nick asked as they walked towards the warehouse. Sir is currently in the family's estate. He told me that you do not need to work for a couple of days, Pator explained. Nick furrowed his brows. Why? He asked. I don't know, sir, Pator said. If I am not told the reason, it means it is not of my concern. However, Sir has also said that someone will be telling you all the necessary things in the headquarters. Someone's going to tell me these things. Nick thought with a raised eyebrow. After walking for a bit, Nick arrived in front of the warehouse. Whenever Nick saw the warehouse, he had to take a short moment to look at it. It wasn't anything big or majestic, but it represented his future. Nick just loved looking at it. Eventually, Nick walked into the warehouse with Pator in tow. As soon as Nick entered the warehouse, he immediately became wary. At this moment, a cloaked figure was closely inspecting the console beside the containment unit of the Dreamer. However, since Winter said that someone was waiting for Nick, he didn't immediately attack. Please, wait outside, Pator, the cloaked person said without turning around. When he heard the voice, Pator realized who it was, and he quickly nodded. Of course, sir. The next moment, Pator walked out of the warehouse. Meanwhile, Nick looked at the cloaked person with furrowed brows. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. The cloaked person turned to Nick. How's reading practice going? The person asked. And then, Nick suddenly remembered where he had heard that voice from. Albert, Nick asked in surprise. The cloaked person, Albert, chuckled and removed the cloak, revealing his gray and black hair. When Nick saw Albert's face, he smiled brightly. What are you doing here? Nick asked as he walked closer. Winter told me what happened, Albert said. He thought you might need a bit of guidance since this is your first Spectre. When Nick heard that, he released a sigh of relief. Naturally, Nick had been quite nervous about the Dreamer. How was he supposed to get Zephyx out of the Dreamer? Nick had no idea. Luckily, Albert was now here, making things much easier. Yes, I think I could use some help, Nick said. Albert chuckled a bit and turned to the console. Everything looks fine, he said. Prefix levels are elevated, but that's to be expected since it is currently recovering. Zephyx levels are at 0, but that's also expected. The Dreamer is not a specter that passively gives off Zephyx. I already took a look at it earlier, and I have to say, you really went to town on this one, Albert said with a chuckle. The poor thing is so beat up that it doesn't even want to move right now. It didn't even move when I poked it. Nick looked with a worried look at Albert. It's not dying, right? Oh, nah, you don't need to worry about that. It's quite hard to kill a specter. To kill it, you would need to destroy the core in its head or shred its torso to pieces. Injuries that would kill humans just put specters in a sort of stasis or hibernation, and as long as they are not isolated from Prefix, they will recover quite rapidly, Albert explained. Nick nodded in relief. He didn't know what he would have done if the Dreamer died after all that had happened. Everything looks good, Albert said once more as he lightly slapped the console. Then, he turned to Nick. Wanna go get Zephyx out of it right now? Nick raised an eyebrow. Winter said that the Dreamer is too injured to be worked with and that it will take a couple of days. Albert's smile widened. He's right. Then, Albert took a small bottle out of one of his pockets and waved it around a bit. But he doesn't know I have this. What's that? Nick asked as he looked at the bottle with interest. The stuff you've been bathing in, Albert said, just a lot stronger. Nick remembered the green bath as he looked at the green liquid. Wait, you're using that on the Dreamer? Nick asked. Why not? Albert asked with a grin. Well, what if something happens? Nick asked. Albert just snorted. What's supposed to happen? Nick, I'm a level 4 extractor. I can kill the Dreamer with a casual kick. Nick scratched the back of his head. Sure, Albert was powerful, but Nick still felt that it was a bit weird to heal a specter with expensive medicine. I mean, sure, if you want to, Nick said with a shrug. Albert's smile widened, and he mischievously moved his eyebrows up and down. Then, Albert pressed a button on the console, and a moment later, the personnel door to the containment unit opened. Albert walked in without hesitation, and Nick followed him nervously. Chapter 30, Negotiation. The lights in the containment unit had already been turned on. Every second the lights were on was expensive, but it was a necessary expenditure. After all, they couldn't work with the specter in the dark. When Nick entered the containment unit, he saw a black shadow in the corner of the room. The Dreamer was lying in the most distant corner, unmoving. All right, Princess, Albert said loudly as he walked towards the Dreamer. Enough moping around. The Dreamer didn't move. Albert opened the small bottle and very carefully removed one drop of liquid with his finger. Then, he just wiped his finger on the Dreamer's head and moved back a bit. A moment later, the Dreamer's body twitched, and then, its body began to smoke. Nick saw how the Dreamer's eyes were regrowing at a visible speed. On top of that, its broken wings and ribs were moving back into place with cracking sounds. Around a minute later, the Dreamer had fully recovered. Even though Nick knew that he was safe behind Albert, he still felt a bit nervous. After all, this was a specter. The Dreamer slowly opened its eyes and looked around the containment unit. Then, its eyes fell on Nick. Ding, 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 ding. Suddenly, a loud alarm sounded in the room. Nick knew what this alarm meant. The alarm sounded when a sharp spike in prefix levels inside the containment unit was measured. A sudden spike in prefix levels meant that the specter was preparing an attack. Apparently, the Dreamer wasn't the biggest fan of Nick. An instant later, the Dreamer shot to its feet and charged at Nick. Hole up, Missy. Bang. Albert's left hand opened and grabbed the Dreamer's head in a fluid motion. The Dreamer flapped around and used its talons to stab Albert's torso. Ding. Yet, when the Dreamer's talons hit Albert's torso, a metallic sound reverberated throughout the room, and Albert wasn't injured in the slightest. Ding, ding, ding. The Dreamer used several more attacks, but no matter what it did, Albert wasn't injured in the slightest. Albert didn't even move. After about 30 seconds, the Dreamer gave up. Obviously, this man right in front of it was far more powerful than it was. There we go, Albert said as he put the Dreamer down again. Now, can we have a normal conversation? The Dreamer just glared at the distant Nick. It really didn't like Nick. Just ignore him for now, Albert said, moving to stand between the Dreamer and Nick. The next moment, Albert squatted to be at eye level with the dreamer. Surprisingly, the dreamer also looked into Albert's eyes. There was no fear in its eyes. "You're a specter that feeds on mentality," Albert said. "You're not a specter that feeds off blood, organs, bodies, death, or unfortunate circumstances. You feed on mentality, which means that you have gone through enough memories to understand what I am saying." "I'm quite sure of it." The dreamer didn't show any reaction. "I'm not sure if you realize your current circumstances. So, let me enlighten you. You have been captured, and you are inside a containment unit from a Zephyx manufacturer." The dreamer showed no reaction. "You are not going to break out. That's not going to happen. This is your new home indefinitely. However, if you manage to gain the trust of the company, we might be able to enter a cooperation in the future. At that point, you can leave the containment unit. But until then, you are stuck here, and I'm also quite sure that you know why we humans catch specters, right?" The dreamer showed no reaction. "We want Zephyx. The stuff you produce when you absorb all that energy from the atmosphere," Albert explained. "As long as you give us Zephyx, your life won't be bad. We will even help you in becoming stronger. The stronger you become, the more prefix and Zephyx you contain, which leaves less prefix and Zephyx for all the specters that are still roaming free. Increasing your power is also in our interest. Because of that, we will not be stealing all of your Zephyx. Only the majority. The precise amount is not up to me, but that's how it usually works. We give you food. You give us Zephyx. You become stronger. We get money. Understand?" The dreamer showed no reaction. It just kept on looking forward. "All right," Albert said as he stood up again. "Let me give you a couple of hours to think. Now, my little friend over here will be doing most of the work. So, I don't want you to attack him." The dreamer moved slightly to the side so that it could look at Nick again. Nick just looked back emotionlessly. The next moment, Albert took out a little gadget from one of his pockets and looked at it. "Man, it really doesn't like you," Albert said to Nick with a chuckle. "Specters aren't usually that angry when they get captured, you know." The gadget Albert had in his hand was a mobile prefix scanner. It had the same function as the alarm from earlier, but it was portable and had a higher sensitivity. Just now, the prefix levels had been going up and down, almost like the dreamer debated attacking Nick again. "Now, listen here. One more thing," Albert said, pushing the dreamer's head to look at him again. "If you don't cooperate, we'll have to do the bargain bin method, and you don't want that." Nick raised an eyebrow. "Bargain bin method?" The dreamer looked at Albert again. "Most specters cooperate to some degree. Not all of them cooperate fully, but they, at least, consume stuff to continue growing, which produces Zephyx. But there are also the specters that completely refuse to do anything. They believe that they can simply use up our money by forcing us to spend resources on keeping them contained without gaining anything from them. These specters are not very popular with the manufacturers, but there is still a way to get money out of them." The next moment, Albert grabbed the tip of the dreamer's right wing. RIIIIP. And tore it off. The dreamer pulled its wing back, but it didn't seem like it was in pain. Albert showed the dreamer the part of the wing he had torn off. Then, Albert took out a small box with a shredder on top. Albert put the part of the dreamer he had torn off onto the shredder, and the shredder immediately turned the part into tiny particles. After that, the wires all over the box started to electrify, and a minute later, the particles in the box vanished. Albert opened the box and showed it to the dreamer. "You get it?" Albert asked. The dreamer looked into the box. Just now, it had felt a bit of Zephyx coming out of the box. "That's the bargain bin method," Albert said. "We can tear about 70% of your body off without killing you. We shove that body into the mixer, get our Zephyx, and give you a week to recover." Albert slowly stood up. "Either you cooperate, or that's your future. It's your decision. We'll be back in about 3 hours." After that, Albert walked